In this session, we will provide a very brief overview of our motivations and vision for Project Nexus. We will provide a deeper dive on the challenges, user experience, and payment flows within Nexus itself. We will hear directly from each of our project partners. And last, time permitting, we will host a short Q&A with the audience as well. So Ben, if I could ask you to share the slides, please. So for the first time in history, we have a viable path towards exploring interlinking real-time payments infrastructures. Over the past decade, there's been a flourishing of payment systems around the world. At last count, over 60 live or under development instant payment systems. And these systems offer convenient, always-on, account-to-account digital payment methods that in many cases become the backbone of a domestic digital economy. In designing Nexus, we kept the G20 targets on speed, transparency, and access in mind as our North Star. Our fundamental hypothesis is that interlinking domestic IPS networks and real-time payments capabilities would allow us to A, orchestrate multi-leg, multi-currency transactions that could pass or fail within less than 60 seconds, provide an always-on modern API-based service for ease of integration for participants, and thirdly, to over time, build a global network that could scale through existing domestic payment networks that provide access to banks and regulated non-bank PSPs alike. This idea, in fact, was born from the numerous regional and global bilateral linkage projects that are underway. It's worth noting that this is a non-exhaustive list that includes both public and private sector-led initiatives. From our perspective, we celebrate these initiatives, these bilateral linkages, which serve to show that A, interlinking payment systems is indeed possible, and B, produce a wealth of experience and insight. However, we do believe that over the long term, a successful payment system ultimately relies on network effects and that a multilateral approach would be needed. The bilateral model becomes progressively more complex for new members to join. The combinatorial math shows that bilateral links simply do not scale. If you have 3 countries, you need 3 links. If you have 4 countries, you need 6 links. And if you have 5 countries, you need 10 links. So complexity increases in a non-linear fashion, and we must plan for success. At best, bilateral links would lead to patchy, disconnected networks, and only the most commercially viable corridors would ultimately survive. Nexus aims to standardize the way IPS systems connect to each other to reduce technical complexity and harmonize the legal scheme and business arrangements required. Importantly, we do leverage existing standards such as ISO 20022 and open APIs. Each instant payment system would run a Nexus gateway in their respective jurisdiction, and is responsible for integration with that domestic network and local operations. Last but not least, Nexus is designed to broker connections not just between instant payment rails, but also between the value-added services such as mobile phone proxy overlay services, or potentially in the future, even QR resolution services. We've been refining the Nexus blueprint for the past 2 years, and I'm very proud to say that 2 weeks ago, we published the Phase 2 Proof of Concept report with Banca d'Italia, Bank Negara Malaysia, Monetary Authority of Singapore, PayNet in Malaysia, and BCS Nets in Singapore. And that content is now live on the BIS website. With that, I will now pass over to Ben Dyson to walk us through a deep dive of the project.
Thank you, Andrew. So we, in designing Nexus, we had to address some of the common challenges in cross-border payments. One of the first of these really is around the FX conversion. So every cross-border payment needs an entity that is willing to take the currency from the sender of that payment and pay out the currency of the recipient. And the way this normally works in cross-border payments is that it requires banks to hold multiple currencies in correspondent accounts in multiple different countries. That can be quite challenging for some of the smaller banks, dividing your liquidity between multiple currencies. And there's also a move at the moment to de-risk with some of the larger banks not being willing to provide correspondent accounts to some of the smaller banks. And so it's becoming harder and harder to make cross-border payments through these networks. The way Nexus works is it reaches out to a competitive market of FX providers, but banks and payment service providers can choose whether or not they want to be an FX provider. So they're not necessarily required to play that role. And smaller banks can actually choose to only deal in their domestic currencies. So they don't necessarily need to hold any correspondent accounts in other countries. And they don't need to hold or manage liquidity across multiple currencies. The second challenge really from a user perspective is how do you actually address a cross-border payment? There is something called an international bank account number, but it can be up to 32 characters. This is not particularly user-friendly if you're trying to enter this into your mobile app. It's also not used in some of the major markets. So for example, you can't use an IBAN to send a payment to the USA, Canada, India, Singapore, or Hong Kong. You could also try to use local account details, but one of the issues there is that those account details are unfamiliar. So as a sender, you're never quite sure if you have the correct format for those account details. And so many countries now are using proxy services. So you can register your mobile number to your account. And we've built on that in Nexus. And what we've said is that any details that will be valid for addressing a payment within your own country should also be valid for addressing a cross-border payment. And so we connect to the proxy directories. So in Singapore, the service is called PayNow. In Malaysia, it's Do It Now. And in the TIPS payment system, there is the mobile proxy lookup. And Nexus connects to those so that if the sender inputs a mobile phone number or maybe an email address or a company identity number, Nexus will reach out to that directory and say which is the account that corresponds to this proxy. You can also use IBAN or local account details as well. Thirdly, the challenges around payment and message processing. So with traditional cross-border payments, it's a little like a pass the parcel model. A payment goes from bank to bank, and the speed of that payment really depends on how quickly each bank picks that payment up and passes it on to the next step. There's also a challenge of how you structure the data in a payment instruction. And there's a wide range of message formats used between different payment systems. And what that can mean is as you go from one payment system to another, you sometimes lose information or that information becomes corrupted. It makes it very difficult for things like sanction screening. Another challenge is that you're not quite sure with some traditional payments, cross-border payments, of the fees that will be charged by each bank. So as a sender of a payment, say you're paying an invoice to a company in another country, that company may call you and say, well, we didn't receive the full amount that you were supposed to pay for this invoice because the fees that have been deducted by banks in the payment chain have come out of that amount that was initially sent. And so with Nexus, what we've tried to do, well, the most fundamental difference here is that we're using the domestic instant payment systems. So payment services like Fast in Singapore, the real-time payments platform in Malaysia, and also TIPS. These domestic payment systems, they process payments between two accounts in the same country in seconds. And so the idea with Nexus is to connect these payment systems together. And the ambition is that most of these payments should complete within 60 seconds. We also use the ISO 20022 standard for data messages, and that's been widely adopted across the payment system right now. And that ensures that we can get more and better quality data through those payment instructions. Nexus is also designed so that all the fees are known up front to the sender, so there's no deductions and there's no surprises. And then finally, one of the most significant pain points in cross-border payments is the sanction screening process. So cross-border payments must be screened against lists of people and companies which are essentially on a blacklist issued by either the United Nations or the EU, the US, or domestic authorities as well. And what that means is that the recipient must share a lot of information with the sender for that payment to go through the sanction screening process. So the recipient may have to share their full name and their full home address. And they may not always want to share that kind of personal information for a payment. The other problem is that the sender may make errors when entering that information. And a third problem is that sanction screening generates a lot of false positives. So where the sanction screening software thinks that somebody is on the sanctions list when actually they're not. And that causes a lot of delays in cross-border payments. With Nexus, so we don't do sanction screening on behalf of the banks. That is still the responsibility of the banks and payment service providers. But what we do is try to reduce the number of false positives by through a request for information process. So that would allow when somebody is trying to make a payment to a certain account, Nexus would ask that bank, the recipient's bank, for further information about the recipient. And the aim is to get verified information from that bank rather than potentially inaccurate information that has been sent by the recipient to the sender and then entered by the sender. So we started the process with thinking about the user experience. So as somebody sending a cross-border payment, what is a good user experience and how do you take some of the friction out of those payments? So let's imagine we have Maria in Italy who wants to send 100 Singapore dollars to Wei Long in Singapore. And she wants to ensure that Wei Long receives exactly 100 Singapore dollars. So this, what you can see on the screen here is kind of a demo app. Nexus itself doesn't have an app. It's a service that will be integrated by the banks and the payment service providers. But this is just to give you an example of how this would look if it was used by a bank. And so the first thing that Maria would do is select the country that she's sending that payment to. So she selects Singapore, and that allows the bank to send a request to Nexus through an API, which says, we're trying to send a payment to Singapore. Please let me know what FX rates are available and who are the FX providers that are providing that FX rate. Nexus responds with that information, and it can display here that this is the current rate, and to send 100 Singapore dollars is going to cost 60 euros and 12 cents. And that exchange rate will be guaranteed for a number of minutes, maybe around 10 minutes, and that's just to allow the sender to complete this payment setup without the rate having to be refreshed. Secondly, Maria needs to address that payment to Wei Long. And as I mentioned, any details that are valid within a country for domestic payments can also be valid through Nexus. So in Singapore, the Pay Now service allows you to register a phone number, a national identity number, a corporate registration number, or a virtual payment address, and also local account numbers. So Maria can enter Wei Long's mobile phone number here. That will send another API request to Nexus. And Nexus will communicate with the Pay Now service in Singapore to retrieve the account that actually belongs to Wei Long. And the Pay Now service will actually respond with a name for the recipient. And so it will say, well, this account belongs to Wei Long. And the sender has an opportunity to confirm that that is the account that they're expecting. This is a really important step for fraud prevention because we ideally don't want people sending payments to account numbers without knowing who that account belongs to. Okay, the next step is for Maria to review all the details. So she can see here exactly what will be deducted from her account, plus the fees that she will have to pay to the bank for this cross-border payment service. She can see the name of the recipient and confirm the details that she entered. And she can see exactly what will be credited to Wei Long's account. Okay, so if she's happy to proceed with that payment, that payment will be submitted by the bank, firstly to the domestic payment system, so TIPS in this example. Then it will go through Nexus, and it will go to the fast payment system in Singapore. And what we expect is that the majority of payments will complete within 60 seconds, or at least they will fail within 60 seconds with certainty. So within about a minute, you have confirmation whether that payment has been successful or not. That contrasts to some of the more traditional cross-border payment services where you may find out hours or even days later that there's been a problem with that payment and that the payment hasn't actually reached the recipient. In around 10 to 15% of payments, sanctions screening will cause a delay. And that we have designed a kind of process for Nexus that allows some of those payments to take a little bit longer. So rather than those payments being rejected outright because there's probably a false positive against the sanctions list, the bank can take a little bit of extra time to resolve that sanctions list, the sanctions hit, and hopefully most of those payments will go through just a little bit later. So that's how it would look from the sender's perspective. Now, from a financial institution perspective, there are really three key roles that financial institutions can play in Nexus. The first is as a payment service provider or a bank, which is sending and receiving cross-border payments on behalf of their customers. The second role is the foreign exchange provider. So this involves offering an exchange rate, accepting the sender's currency and paying out the recipient's currency. An FX provider can be a bank or payment service provider as well, but it could also be a non-bank broker-dealer, for example, a major player in the FX markets. The third role is as a settlement account provider, and settlement account providers are essentially PSPs who provide accounts to FX providers. And they do this in the case that an FX provider doesn't have direct membership of a particular payment system. So for example, if there's a FX provider that can provide FX to the Singapore dollar, but it isn't a member of the fast payment system, a local bank in Singapore could provide a settlement account to that FX provider. These roles are not exclusive, so depending on the financial institution, they may play one or more roles, and they may play different roles for different payments as well. So it's quite a flexible model that allows financial institutions to choose how they want to participate. And so that gives us the full arrangement of participants in Nexus. We have the sender and the recipient. We have the sender's bank, the source PSP, and the recipient's bank, the destination PSP. We have two instant payment systems, one in the sender's country, one in the recipient's country. And each of those instant payment systems runs a Nexus gateway. And if you remember, the gateway is the software that allows communication between these different systems. Then we have potentially two settlement account providers, although if the FX provider is a member of both payment systems, those settlement account providers are not needed. Okay, and then just to talk through how payments are processed, there is a more detailed explanation of this on the website, but I'll just give you the kind of high-level view. So firstly, once the sender has confirmed that they're happy to proceed with the payment, their bank will send this payment through the domestic payment system here. So that will be processed more or less as a domestic payment. And so 100 euros will be transferred from the source PSP, that's the sender's bank, to the FX provider's account at the settlement account provider here. So the FX provider now has 100 euros extra. It's received the funds from the recipient, and it holds an account in the destination country that needs to hold at least enough money to make that payment. So at least 150 Singapore dollars here. Once this first payment is complete, a message is sent to, through Nexus to the destination instant payment system. So this is fast in Singapore now. And that will trigger a second payment between the settlement account provider, the FX provider's settlement account provider here. So 150 Singapore dollars will be transferred to the recipient's bank here. So the FX provider now, its account balance would be reduced by 150. Once this payment is complete, the recipient's bank can inform them that the payment that they've received those funds. And a message goes back through Nexus to say that that payment was successful. So the sender can be notified. And Nexus also updates the FX provider to let them know that they have received 100 euros and they have paid out 150 Singapore dollars from their account. So there's a lot happening on this screen. But in simple terms, what is happening is there is a domestic payment here in Italy in the TIPS payment system. And then there is a second domestic payment in Singapore in the fast payment system. Nexus basically plays the role of communicating between these two different systems. And if anything does go wrong at any point, particularly in the destination country, Nexus will be informed of that, and Nexus can therefore reverse this payment so that those funds go back to the sender and nobody ends up out of pocket. So as I say, there's a much more detailed step-by-step walkthrough of that on the Nexus website. Okay, so finally, just to talk through what we've developed in the proof of concept. So this was a 12-month proof of concept between Singapore, Malaysia, and the Eurosystem. And the outputs of that really, so we successfully connected those three, testing versions of those instant payment systems. So we asked each of the instant payment system operators to create a full working replica of their domestic payment system and a full working replica of their proxy directory service as well. There was no real money going through this because you don't test on a live payment system. And we also didn't use any real user data. So the people in the proof of concept were made up and the accounts were made up as well. But through this process, what we have developed is a technical blueprint, which we are kind of working towards a standard for connecting instant payment systems together. And so that includes everything from the APIs that you can use, the message standards. So we use the ISO 20022 message standards, but in a specific way for Nexus cross-border instant payments. And also the kind of processes and how do you handle errors, for example. All of that is detailed here on the Nexus website, and we'll share the link to that shortly. Secondly, we developed a draft scheme. So every instant payment system requires a kind of a rule book, which provides all the rules for how PSPs and FX providers interact with the service and with each other. So it describes, for example, what makes you eligible for Nexus, the roles and responsibilities, the service levels that are required. So for example, if you receive a payment that you can't accept immediately because of a sanctions hit, how much time do you have to process that payment before you have to return it? It also describes the fee structures, so not the level of the fees, but who is allowed to charge who between the different participants, and the transparency requirements as well. So some of the things that I described earlier about the need to show the sender exactly what they will be charged and exactly what will be credited to the recipient. Then there also needs to be a governance framework. So how is the Nexus scheme itself managed, and how are changes made to that scheme over time? So we developed a draft version of this, and we'll be developing this further in the next phase of the work. And then finally, we developed working software to connect these instant payment systems. So I won't go into too much technical detail here, but this is essentially a number of microservices that handle the different functions in Nexus. So the FX rates and conversion, the coordination of the payment between the different payment systems. There's a proxy service that allows you to take a proxy and resolve that to a specific account. And then a reference data service that includes all of the information required to make Nexus run. And each instant payment system operator had their own instance of that gateway, which they could configure to connect to their domestic payment system. And then those payment systems those gateways connect to Nexus gateways in other countries. And so this is working software. It's proof of concept grade, so it's not, it doesn't necessarily have the resilience, security, or performance that you would require for live payments. But we did manage to send realistic payments between each of these countries. So with that, I will hand back to Andrew to talk about our next steps.
Thank you, Ben. So we will be starting the Q&A section shortly after the remarks from partners and colleagues. And I would encourage audience members to add their questions to the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand corner of the WebEx interface. Regarding next steps, as has been alluded to and announced, the ASEAN 5 central banks have indeed announced a vision for regional payments interconnectivity. And this builds on the success of the various bilateral initiatives between Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and the Philippines. And they're now really seeking to establish a multilateral arrangement with a broad array of cross-border payment services, including QR code, fast payment, interconnectivity, and other value-added services as well. So in that context, and Ben, if you could advance the slides maybe 2. We're very happy and proud to be working with ASEAN 5 central banks and their respective instant payment system operators. Over the next 12 months, the Nexus team will be working closely with all partners to really try to finalize the technical, operational scheme, governance, and business arrangements that would be needed to support this broad, pan-ASEAN vision. We also do want to maintain a very global perspective, and we'll be convening a global advisory panel to ensure that this work does remain broadly applicable and relevant on the global stage. So please watch that space as well. One last plug, as Ben had mentioned, the report is live on the BIS website, and please do take the time to check out the microsite at docs.bis.org/nexus. There is a ton of content there, much more than what we were able to present today. And in fact, all of the slide material was drawn from this microsite. So you'll see substantively a lot more information there.